didn't belong out here in the oil field. Well, the ground was about 8 feet above what it is right now. But it's not like bowling or any other games, which have a real tremendous surface expression of it. But used to, like I say, it used to be when this lake wasn't here, and it was higher.
And the flag?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. That's where the original discovery well was drilled.
Wow.
Well, no, the monument used to be, where we made a real tight right. Monument.
Here at the historic site of the Lucas Discovery Well at Spindletop that came in on January 10th, 2001. And we were here to celebrate the 100th anniversary with Mike Halbody, and I remember two things that were really important that he said. Number one, he said that Spindletop grew slowly, so it had a large fetch area. It uplifted a large area as opposed to Salt Dome that had a very narrow uplift. And the second thing was there were two major booms at Spindletop. The first one was in the Cap Rock in 1901, and the second one was in 1926 when Mars McLean, they produced down the flanks of the Salt Domes. And then there was even a third later boom when people started to realize that there was a salt overhang, and Mike Halbody at High Island realized that. And so we saw some pictures today from Robert Pledger.
It's got anhydride in the calcium sulfate.
Oh, okay.
And the calcium sulfate deteriorates or decomposes into sulfur, and
the high spot, so it's basically like a cap on top of an antibody.
Yeah, but I mean, you got salt underneath, and then you got that stuff on top. So what was?
Yeah. Well, some of the reservoir rock.
List of companies, you realize none of them existed. And you would have thought a company the size of May Petroleum, Sun Oil would still be around. I wanted to start back at where we really didn't get to go, and this is a geomap of the Gulf Coast. And what I've got there is kind of put the thing together is Interstate 10 is this red line that runs right here through Beaumont, and you just came through there. The blue circles represent salt domes in what we call the Houston Salt Dome Basin. This salt dome that you see right here, I can't find Big Hill. Fanette is a dome. Big Hill sitting right in here. Is the edge of the Hackberry embayment. If you go much further west than Big Hill Salt Dome, the Hackberry sand does not exist. And so if you look at your stratigraphic chart, it's intruded in the Oligocene in the Frio section, and you're able to tie it down. It's got a distinctive index fossil, so when we drill wells, we analyze those index fossils to determine what formation we're drilling through. Interestingly, we're Spindletop. I'm not very good left-handed, so I'm going to turn this around and stand on the other side. Spindletop is a piercement type salt dome. It came up through a zone of weakness. Adjacent to it are some fairly large salt domes. Orangefield Dome is at the very north. Adjacent to it is Port Neches. Down to the south would be Fanette, and there's Big Hill on the south edge. Big Hill is where they have the National Petroleum Reserve storage. And then to the north is Sour Lake. The thing that's interesting, if you go back to the museum, you'll notice the discovery date. For example, Sour Lake was 1902, Spindletop was 1901, Port Neches was 29, Orange was 1913, Big Hill was 41, and Clem Lake was 37. Interestingly, both Big Hill and Clam Lake are out in the middle of the marsh. So there was no surface feature there, and it was difficult for them to get gravity on it. So the first pass was found of the salt domes were found because they were topographic features. The second pass was using the gravity meter. And I think the thing that was interesting as I worked Spindletop and also Port Neches and Orange, the data that we had to work with every time new data came out, we went from reflection to refraction seismic, or we went from 2D to 3D, there was a bump in production. And it's because you've heard the really trite phrase, finding new reserves in an old area with new tools. And that's what they're doing here at Spindletop right now. Spindletop's over 100 years old and we're still drilling wells here. This is Spindletop as it looks today. And the thing that's interesting is you can see the circular nature of it. These are the lakes that were created from the withdrawal of the sulfur. And Don talked about that earlier, but I remember as a student here on the east side of the road you came in on, there were mountains of sulfur there, just looked like slabs. And they would truck it out or train it out all the time. Interestingly, the park we're going to go to is right here. The original monument and the original Lucas Gusher was drilled right there. So you were asking, Charles, where it's located. Right on the very crest of the dome. And when I was with Sun Oil in the 60s, we have a local airport, we'd fly out going to Houston or Dallas. You could fly over the dome and you could literally see the beds dipping away, and you could see it was just a hill out there in the middle of the marsh. But since they've cleaned it up, you don't see all the things you used to see, and it's unless you're a geologist, you really wouldn't even recognize it. This is the one we talked about, but the thing that's interesting about it, I'll show you in a minute. It was completed originally at TD at 1,139 feet in the cap rock. As previously been mentioned, it did about 1 million barrels in 10 days. You're going to get a feel for what 100,000 barrels of oil a day looks like in a few minutes. But the dome only covers 800 acres. It's small, but it's done 150 million barrels. It's a lot of oil. And if you do material balance as an engineer, or you try to put those reserves back into 800 acres, you can't do it. And that was one of the problems I ran into when I operated out here for doing the reserve reports on an annual basis. The engineers couldn't put the reserves back in the ground that we produced in a year. So how do you do your reserve report to project where you're going? This is what it looked like 22 months after the discovery well. Now, I was in my garage yesterday looking for a map that had been given to me by the president of Amoco after they had bought Yontley Oil Company. And it was the only base map I could find that had the wells spotted in the right place, because people didn't know where they were, first of all. They didn't keep up with them, second of all. Thirdly, it was on such a scale that nobody cared, because you're talking about a map that's on a 1 to 100 or a 1 to 200 scale. So the only way you could ever figure out where the wells were was literally go out in the field and mark them, and before GPS, you just had to get them off the corners. Now we can do it with GPS. But I remember there was over 1,100 wells in the field. Now, they started drilling in 1901. They drilled wells, a lot of wells. But remember, we didn't start electric logs until 1934. So we had 25 years of drilling where there was no record other than the original driller's logs of what those wells did. So when you, as a geologist, are working at Salt Dome, and it applies to every one of them, the libraries kept a record of those original driller's logs. And the guys who did those drillers' logs were really, really good. When I started out 40 years ago as a junior geologist, I thought everybody older than me was stupid. Amazing how smart they are today at 70. But the point is, you would see a log and they'd say we drill sand from 2302 to 2330. If you took that as we do in SP and a resistivity, and you put it on a piece of paper, you've got an electric log. And it gives you points of correlation. The thing I liked was, we drilled from 2200 to 2250, and the well flowed at 25,000 barrels a day. I want to find out where that sand was. So we did a lot of that. Then we adopted 2D data. 2D data is great with a salt dome, but you really can't tell the detail that we want. It wasn't until the advent of 3D that we could really see things that we never saw before, and that's what's really stimulating. We've seen this before, and the reason I passed this out is the section we're looking at on the dome is Miocene and Frio. I don't know of any wells that have gone as deep as the Yawa on the dome. Has there been? Okay, the Yawa is the Eocene age rock we've got out here. But the key is we don't have any outcrops, we don't have anything to key off of, except in our drilling samples when we catch our samples and analyze it to see what the paleo looks like. So I gave you the chart so you can see what the index fossils are for each of the formations. The things that are significant about Spindletop is, as I mentioned earlier, it only covers 804 acres, so it's tiny. Second thing is that you see in the 3D, you see several pulses of growth of the dome. You'll see it as unconformities or disconformities, and you'll see it as faults that displace other faults, indicating, older faults are broken by the youngers. As I mentioned early on, when you go into it and you start analyzing the wells, how do you distinguish what it's producing out of? Because some of the oil is sour, some is high paraffin, some has an emulsion in it, so you have to cut it with chemicals. Some is heavier. Generally, the oil at Spindletop is any place between 22 degrees and as much as 31 degrees. So the problem is, as an operator, handling it requires you to understand what your oil is going to do for you. So what we found was in 1952, there was a guy at Humble Oil and Refining who did an analysis, and he typed the oil, and you could tell which oil you were producing. Every well that we had and every well we drill has multiple horizons. I went through, 800 wells, and on an average, I found between 12 and 16 paste sands in every well. And when you went back and analyzed the historical production, every sand produced between 10 and 20,000 barrels. So, deductive reasoning is if you've got a well with 10 pays in it, you've got a 100,000 barrel well. Good way to run your economics, and that's the way to go in and finally ran our reserves. Because you can't go in and make a top of sand, base of sand, net pay isopac on 16 pay sands that you don't know the limits of. So how else would you calculate your reserve potential? Well, one of the things we learned early on was after they started drilling the E logs in 1934 until they became focus logs in 1950, the length of the tool was 15 feet 4 inches. It was not a focus tool. So when you sent out your electrical current from the top electrode pulling it up through the sand, you got a peak. When you sent it out through the bottom electrode and it went through the sand, it gave a peak. Because the two curves were 15 feet apart, the two peaks didn't overlap each other, only in horizontal beds. I had an engineer that worked for Schlumberger who came in and analyzed a bunch of 1935 to 1940 logs for me and found that the beds were dipping at any place between 60 and 80 degrees. Which means, if I've got a well with 300 feet of pay in it, I don't have a well with 300 feet of pavement. But the hard part was there was no way to correlate one well to another. And it likened it to if you took a deck of cards and threw it out on the table and you drilled in the deck of cards. Some places you would hit certain sands, and some places you would not hit those same sands, and there would be places you would drill and you would find the same sand. So when you correlated through the well log, you'd see places where you could correlate tit for tat going down the hole. And then there were things that you never saw again or were going to see again. But it was really interesting from that viewpoint. As I mentioned earlier, there have been periods of drilling just based on technology. The sands are extremely permeable and porous. Porosities range as high as 34%. And the permeabilities were in the 500 to 700 millidarcy range. Had different drive mechanisms. We had water drive, we had pressure depletion, we had combinations. We had zones that would just deplete, period. The problem on the dome was you didn't know what that well did in 1912 or 1923 or 1930. So every time you drill a well, some zones would be virgin pressure, some wells would be partially depleted, and some wells, you'd look at the log and you'd say, it's got to produce. There wasn't anything left in it. So it was a challenge as a geologist to try to figure out where the best place was to drill.
How saline is the water?
Huh?
How saline is the water?
Water was any place between 60 and 90,000 parts per million. And that brings me to the last point. Spindletop was the last salt dome to have what we call tidal disposal. That means that when you produced water, you put it in a ditch, and the ditch water ran into the Nature's River. So you're putting 90,000 part per million water into the river. And the joke used to be, you could watch this brown water running into the river, and that's your tubing. It's eating your tubing up. And there wasn't any chemicals we could use to stop the corrosion. The salt water was too corrosive. Those are some of the unique things about Spindletop. Yes, sir?
It's very high porosity. I just wonder how lithified, how compacted these sands are.
They were not compacted at all.
Okay, so then I would have to assume that compaction was one of your production mechanisms.
That's correct.
And this is where the oil, which you would have to store somewhere, is there. And this is one thing your reservoir engineers assumed didn't exist.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And you had a real problem with trying to figure out what your lowest known oil would be because you had no way to determine what the down dip limits were. The only thing you could do was you knew where the rim syncline was, so you knew the fetch area into the dome. So you knew you could do the volume of the rock that's above the fetch to the dome itself and calculate a certain volume of porous sand that would contain hydrocarbons to get an overall recovery for the dome.
Are they early day topo maps, high quality topo maps of the dome? I'm just wondering whether from the topo maps you can establish how much the ground is sunk.
We did that. I had a geophysicist that works with me, and he went through and he went back through time and he got topo sheets from 32, and then he got it again in World War II, and he got it again, I think, in 1956 or something. And he did that calculation. I can't tell you how much it subsided, but at one time, the field was about 8 to 10 feet above the rest. Ground level out here is only 20 feet. So we've got a 20-foot KB out here.
It would have been interesting to be able to figure out the volume of subsidence.
Yeah. But the other part of it is a lot of it was caused by the withdrawal of the sulfur. So it's not real substance. The interesting thing that we talked about, the ladies indicated, is this is the location of Spindletop, and there are 26 major refineries between Spindletop and the Gulf Coast. And so this is the place that the oil that you're seeing coming out of the Eagle Ford and the Wolfberry in West Texas is all coming to the Gulf Coast. Motiva has a refinery out here. capable of doing 600,000 barrels of oil a day. They just expanded it 2 years ago. So they're able to handle the oil that's coming out of all these flush, unconventional plays that we have right now. But you can see that what Dr. Evans was talking about earlier, the relationship of Beaumont to Spindletop to the Neches River is pretty significant. Spindletop has 5 gas storage or LNG storage facilities associated with it, and this is where they're located on the dome. So there's room right now. The Gladys City Agency is trying to find someone who would put in another one in what they call Area A. And I wasn't aware of this until somebody told me. They'll wash out the salt in the and make a cavern, then they'll load LNG or oil or whatever into it. And they can have multiple places in a salt dome that's washed out. I would have thought only had one place, and that, you know, you're the only person who was going to do it. But they did. You can see here they're doing it in multiple places. This is the 3D that was shot in 2002. It's a 51 square mile 3D. It was shot on 62.5 foot bin sizes, and it covers, you know, enough of the dome to be able to see everything you'd be interested in. And that's the thing you're interested in. So you have long enough offsets to be able to image what you see downhole. Here's one of the cross sections through the dome. This is an east-west cross section across the dome, almost in the middle of the data set. Kind of put it in perspective, and we'll go in another minute. Notice how the salt is deforming the formations. Tells you that the salt was moving at the same time or moving after deposition of the formations. That's one of the important things, because you can date your movement of the salt, and it'll help you focus in on the areas you want to do business. I'll go back to these. I just want to go through them because you get a chance to look at them. This is the north-south line across the dome. Again, you can see how complicated it is, and if you go down in great detail, you can see a lot of disconformities, a lot of sand lenses, you see a lot of little hanging faults. Yes, ma'am?
What's your horizontal and vertical scales there?
My vertical scale would be, this is about 2.5 seconds right here. So that would be about 8,000 feet. And I'll show you some time slices. I've gone in and sliced it out, and then we'll go back. That's the reason I wanted to kind of let you see the general geology and geophysics, and then we'll go back and rebuild it. This is a time slice through the cap rock at the date 1,139 feet, where the Lucas Gusher was completed. And because of offset and fold and skips and the lakes, those lakes are acidic too. So it's not, you're not going to go fishing out there, unless you like, you know, eating 3-eyed fish. But the point is, you're up in the cap rock here. You don't see a real good distinction of where the top of the salt is, because the formation density difference is not as much as it would be if you were actually into the salt. This is a time slice at about half a second, 1,800 feet. And you're beginning to see some definition of the salt. If you go down to 1 second, this is a better image of the salt. You can see it's pretty compact. It stays in the place it's supposed to be. This would be at about 1.5 seconds. Or excuse me, this would be about 1 second. The other one was 0.5 seconds. The other one prior to that was 0.3. And you can see the dome has a northwest, southeast orientation. You can see the big faults coming out of the dome here. And I think that's the major fault that caused the dome to come up right here, because it ties to the southwest into a major field called Lovell's Lake. And Exxon drilled 150 wells there, maybe a lot of wells, a big anticline. This is the time would be the headline. If you looked, and we'll go back, but this is a good marker that comes in above the Frio. The headline is a major, it's called Heterostogina SP, and it is a major line that comes in the middle of the Anahuac shell wedge. And for geologists working the Gulf Coast, you look for the headline marker in this area. So the headline is a significant marker. In this well, it's at about, in this 3D, it's about 1.6 to 1.8 seconds. Depends on what your velocity survey is. But it's a great marker to key off of. Now, on many of the salt domes, the head is productive as coquina. So you actually get oil production out of the head if the dome was at wave base at the time of the deposition of the head. Then this is a 1 second, 1.5, no, this is 2 seconds. And you can see the dome has very good definition. You can see the beds are turned up against the flank of the dome. Again, we've got a lot of faulting. It's hard to pick the faulting out, and it's hard to map the trace of your faults in this 3D data set without going from one horizon to another, because you really, typically in the Gulf Coast, faults dip at about a 45-degree angle. So if you move a mile on the surface, you move a mile down, and it goes over that far. But here, the faults do not necessarily follow that trace because they've been deformed by salt movement. Then this is about 2.5 seconds, which is about 9,000 feet. And at 2.5 seconds here, you're talking about one of the deep, we're down close to the hackberry at this point. Or maybe Notoceria blampedi. So when you get back to your strat charts, you can figure out which formations I'm talking about. But again, that's the way we relate to the depositional model in here, is by paleo record.
The dome seems to be getting wider with depth.
It is, and one more, Martin, watch this. Now we're down at 3 seconds. You really don't see the dome, because now you're in the salt that's related to the Luan, which is the blanket salt that's covering in the Gulf Coast. Now, I don't know if Spindletop's a detached salt dome or not, because in order to image it, it takes special processing to be able to image where the salt flank is and differentiate its relationship to the formations. Yes, Charles?
So could there be prospects underneath?
There could be, and that changes your velocity, it changes your bottom hole pressure, it changes your mud weight, it changes everything the way you drill a well. But it's worth, it's amazing. This is an amazing dome because it's 100 years old and there's not a whole lot of science and technology that I've seen that says, man, this is a great place. I think it's a great place because of the things we just talked about. Then this is a time slice at about 4,000 feet, and what I've done is I've gone in and put the faults in it. The radio's coming out of the dome. And you get a little better definition of where those faults are, and you can see the offsets. And here we again, now this is the one I put in for you, Charles, because this shows the overhang that Halbooty drilled. And I didn't know there was an overhang on Spindletop till I saw this. But some of these domes we have here really look like a mushroom, which have a pronounced overhang. This one's not as pronounced as I can see. But it's still worth chasing. The heavy red and black line down here, that's your headline marker. So even across the room, a blind man can see it. But you can see that it's very complicated. It's a lot of breaks in the section. There's a lot of disconformities. It's just, for a geologist, you could spend your lifetime working here. Yes, Bridget?
When was this processed?
Processed in 2002 or 3. I don't have the advanced volumes. All I've got is a PST. But I know there are some advanced volumes out there. It would be great for some advanced work. Here's another shot of the line beside the dome. This is what we're talking about, the faults of different ages in the section. And then another one, and you can see how complex the faulting occurs And the faulting is related to the salt movement. So as the salt starts moving, the overlying beds start to crack up. And it stops, and then it starts moving again, and the beds crack up again. So you have different periods of faulting in here. You've got faulting like this that stops all this older faulting. And then I don't have it on this map, but maybe that one is a fault that comes, there's some faults that come all the way to the surface. I think you can actually see, if you go out and work the data, some faults that are coming actually to the surface out here. And then this is for those of you who like wiggle trace. Sometimes you can see more with wiggle trace than you can with the high color raster. But this is a good section because the amplitudes show out. And if you gain them up some, you can almost see where the hydrocarbons would be and where they wouldn't be. Of course, we all know that could be related to porosity or a lot of other things. But tying it back to the well control is the key. So that's kind of where we are. We can go back and look at them. I learned to run a mouse. But this is a north-south line through the dome. Remember the heavy red and black right here is your head line, so that's about 6,000 to 8,000 feet. So it's a real good index. Yes, Mark?
Do you have the records from the chlorine or the sulfur?
No, I don't.
Because the reason I ask that is I wonder how thick the caprock is. Sometimes in sulfur exploration, you drill a couple wells all the way to salt to make sure you solve the caprock.
Yeah, I'm sure Texas Gulf Sulfur did that because they didn't quit producing sulfur. You were wondering, Don, I went back and checked. They didn't quit frost mining sulfur until 1975. So it's not that old.
So when they started doing the storage of the various liquids, did you see any of that in this 3D?
I couldn't tell. I didn't, from the processing that I have, I couldn't see clear enough definition in the salt, which I would love to have.
Because that's a bunch of different liquids put in there.
Yeah, that's one of the things as a geologist working in a salt dome, I would love to two things. One is to be able to distinguish if they had done anything in the salt, whether there was some detached sedimentation in there that you could drill.
Yeah.
And the third thing was, I couldn't get good definition between the edge of the salt and the formations. And you have to do a lot of very special analysis to get that interface.
Indeed, most of the salt stuff I've seen, you lose the ability to get anything back at a certain depth. What's your limit on your angle on the dip that you can actually see?
You can see 60 degrees.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know we've seen things a lot higher than that, and you lose it,
Yeah.
and it's amazing.
Yeah.
You also said earlier that you cannot account for you got too much oil for the volume you could map. So have you any ideas where that's coming from?
Well, I think what I think what you're seeing, let me lace through this one. Go back to the section. You're draining, and I've seen it on one of the lines. You can see an actual change in amplitude where the down dip oil-water contact is for one of the major, like the Marge Eddy or the Marge Howie. And you can actually see it's a clear interface. So you know how far out it's draining. All your well control is up here close to the edge of the dome, but you're draining all the way out to the rim syncline.
Any microseismic activity associated with
I think they're probably seeing some minor faulting. I haven't seen anything. I take a website called Live Faulting or liveearthquakes.com. I've been watching the one in Chile and the one in California that's going on right now. But I haven't seen any activity here. But I'm sure it is because we have it in Oklahoma and we've had it in the Houston area, even around the domes we have over there. Yes, sir.
Earlier today we heard that if you would have drilled a well that started about 50 feet south, you would have had a dry hole. Why would that be?
I don't know. That I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, is there any evidence of seeps on the seismic? Because they discussed there was lots of gas coming out, and I didn't know if you
Yeah,
could
Linda,
find...
I don't see any plumes like I see in Alaska. I see those all the time in Alaska, the plumes up and on the seismic data, but I don't see any plumes here. Do you?
No, but I would suspect that any and all those faults that you see, those do come to the surface. We have them in Houston. You know, they come to the surface, and you can bet that that's where those seeps were the strongest when he was sticking his cane in. I mean, those things come to the surface.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember years ago going down to shoot some seismic in Matagorda County, and all of a sudden coming upon the Texas nuclear plant. Kind of, I wasn't, and we were shooting seismic down there, so I went back to look to see where those faults were.
Rotary rig is upstairs. And so if you want to if some of you want to go upstairs first, it depends on how y'all like to hoard. Some people just, want to stay together, and y'all can do that if you really want to. And some people like to spread out their own, see things, read things on their own. So we're leaving you that choice up to you. But like I say, the best chronology with some beginning material here, and then geology. The only thing that's not working right now is a video on offshore drilling. So if you push that button, it's not going to work. Banging on it is not going to make it work. Okay? But there's a whole.
I don't think you can get there from here.
Yeah.